Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare.
So we can get some volunteers to distribute some Bhagavad Gitas, those who would like it. Raise your hands if you want a Gita for the sake of the course. So we'll begin with offering our prayers to the lineage of spiritual masters and to Sri Panchatattva and Lord Krishna. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurumilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. I was born in the darkest ignorance, and my spiritual master opened my eyes with the torch of knowledge. I offer my respectful obeisances unto him. Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Krishnaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharini Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschata Desha Tarini. I offer my respectful obeisances unto His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada, who is very dear to Krishna, having taken shelter at His lotus feet. O Master, we offer our obeisance unto you, O servant of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami. You're kindly preaching the message of Lord Chaitanya in the Western countries, which is full of voidism and impersonalism. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya, Prabhu Nityananda, Shri Advaita Gadadhara, Shivasari Gauravatsa. I offer my respectful obeisance unto Shri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Prabhu Nityananda, Shri Advaita Gadadhara, Srivas, and all others in the line of devotion. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So this is part 2 of a discourse from last week, where we had part 1, and the topic was what leads humanity to go into dark places, so the destruction of humanity. And it really, Krishna boils it down to these 2 pairs of verses, which are in chapter 2, and we'll be reading we read from verse 62 last time, which is Dhyayato Vishayam Pumsaha Sanjas Deju Vijayate Sangat Sanjayate Kamaha Kamata Krodho Vijayate. So when the objects of the senses come in contact with the senses, one develops attachment for them, and from such attachment lust develops, and from lust anger arises. So we had begun with why are there issues or problems in this material world, and Krishna summarizes in these 2 verses on what causes destruction of humanity, which begins with Dhyayato Vishayam Pumsaha, so when contemplating the object of the senses. So we'll move on to text 63, where we will go on to the second half. So text 63 is as follows, and you may repeat after me. Krodhat bhavati sammoha.
Krodhat bhavati sammoha.
Sammohat smriti vipramaha.
Sammohat smriti vipramaha.
Smriti brahmashada buddhinasho.
Smriti brahmasa buddhinasho.
Buddhinasho Buddhinashat pranashyati.
Buddhinashat pranashyati.
Krodhat bhavati sammoha.
Krodha bhavati sammoha.
Sammohat smriti vipramaha.
Sammoha smriti viprama.
Smriti brahmashada buddhinasho.
Smriti brahmasha buddhinasho.
Buddhinashat pranashyati.
Buddhinashat pranashyati.
Krodhat bhavati sammoha.
Krodha bhavati sammoha.
Sammot smriti vipramaha.
Sammoha smriti viprama.
Smriti brahmashada buddhinasho.
Smriti brahmasha buddhinasho.
Buddhinashat pranashyati.
Buddhinashat pranashyati.
So we will go word for word and you can repeat after me as well. Krodhat from anger. Bhavati takes place. Sammoha perfect illusion. Sammoha from illusion. Smriti of memory. Vibramaha bewilderment. Smriti Brahmashada after bewilderment of memory. Buddhinasha loss of intelligence. Buddhinasha and from loss of intelligence. Pranashyati one falls down. Alright, thank you very much. So we will go on to the translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. From anger, complete delusion arises, and from delusion, bewilderment of memory. When memory is bewildered, intelligence is lost, and when intelligence is lost, one falls down again into the material world. Purport. Srila Rupa Goswami has given us this direction. Prapanchitkaya buddhaya hari sambandhi vastuta mumukshubhi parityago vairagyam palgu katyate, which is from the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. By development of Krishna consciousness, one can know that everything has its use in the service of the Lord. Those are without knowledge of Krishna consciousness artificially try to avoid material sense objects. And as a result, although they desire liberation from material bondage, they do not attain to the perfect stage of renunciation. Their so-called renunciation is called falgu, or less important. On the other hand, a person in Krishna consciousness knows how to use everything in the service of the Lord. Therefore, he does not become a victim of material consciousness. For example, for an impersonalist, the Lord or the Absolute, being impersonal, cannot eat, whereas an impersonalist tries to avoid good eatables. A devotee knows that Krishna is the supreme enjoyer and that he eats all that is offered to him in devotion. So, after offering good eatables to the Lord, the devotee takes the remnants called prasadam. Thus, everything becomes spiritualized and there is no danger of a downfall. The devotee takes prasadam in Krishna consciousness, whereas the non-devotee rejects it as material. The impersonalist, however, cannot enjoy life due to his artificial renunciation. And for this reason, a slight agitation of the mind pulls him down again into the material pool of existence. It is said that such a soul, even though rising up to the point of liberation, falls down again due to his not having support in devotional service. Okay. So here we see that first the slippery slope begins with dhyayata vishayam pumsaha, when the objects of the senses are being contemplated upon by the senses and the mind, and that leads to attachment. That attachment leads to intense material desire, lust, and then from that lust you get angry because you're not able to get that particular object for your own gratification. Then what happens is when you are angry, you become completely delusional. Delusional meaning that you're not able to discern what is right from wrong, and from that delusional state of mind comes bewilderment of memory, which means that the intelligence which is higher than the mind is completely gets lost from us. And in doing so, when one's intelligence is lost, one again falls down into the material pool. So intelligence meaning buddhi pranashyati, the intelligence is completely destroyed in one sense. So therefore, this can be something that's even experienced. So that's the beauty of Krishna. He summarizes, why are there downfalls in the world in these two verses. And one can even experience that when one is in an angered state of mind, their ability to make judgments or decisions is very poor. Do you find that? When you're in an angry state of mind that you kind of, hey, I should have, maybe thought a little bit. Oftentimes what's explained is, a trick to this is there is a particular stimuli and there's a certain reaction. And what it said is to be able to mitigate this anger, one must make the distance in terms of time to be greater in between the stimuli and reaction. So if we see a certain type of activity or words being spoken, and it may seem to agitate us, the best thing to do is to actually think calmly and patiently without having to jump into that particular action of anger. And what that does is it saves us from being, going down into the pitfalls of being completely lost to anger, right? So here we see that, one can completely go onto the material world. So we find all of this to be true. Why? Because this is Krishna, who is the supreme absolute truth, giving us truth in the form of Bhagavad Gita. So when we distribute Bhagavad Gita to the public or to people who come here for the first time and so forth, it is done so in the spirit of this is universal spiritual knowledge which has been coming down from time immemorial before the creation of the universe. And Krishna is here kindly giving us this knowledge, re-speaking again in the form of Bhagavad Gita 5,200 years ago. And we must take advantage of this knowledge because ultimately it's going to save us from all the pitfalls of material life. So then Prabhupada, what he says, something is very interesting, is he quotes Rupa Goswami because obviously when one thinks of, okay, you're convinced that after a while that, okay, I've experienced material enjoyment, there's limitations of material enjoyment, what do I do now, right? So then a spiritualist may think, or maybe a spiritualist who may be very, in an elementary level or an impersonalist, they'll say, well, materialism is bad. So therefore, spirituality is when I completely reject materialism and keep it at bay, right? So they try and artificially see everything as, okay, everything there around me is just enjoyment and I'm supposed to simply avoid it. So renunciation is very much supported by our acharyas, our holy teachers. But there's two types of renunciation. One type of renunciation is called Falgu Vairagya, and the other one is Yukta Vairagya. This is a key distinction between the way we live as devotees and why Vaishnavas follow the path of Yukta Vairagya and not Falgu Vairagya. So Falgu meaning obviously you have the word fal, which means fruit, which means the fruits of one's own labor. So whether this is one's paycheck or one's own gifts they may get or some remuneration they may attain as a result of doing their work, they see that as, okay, I'm supposed to reject, so vairagya means having renunciation from, and similarly the impersonalists, because they think that the Lord is impersonal, the Lord does not have any senses, does not taste, does not walk, does not hear, they think that all this prasadam is simply material. So their conception is that. Whereas the Vaishnava's conception, which is a much more well-developed theological conception, is that the Lord does have transcendental body and transcendental senses. As we see in the Brahma Samhita as, Ishvara Parama Krishna Satchit Ananda Vigraha. So the Vigraha, the body, is Satchit Ananda, it's a completely spiritual body. So therefore, when we offer food to Krishna, it becomes completely spiritualized. But the impersonalist spiritualist looks at that food and says, okay, well, that is still material because it's of this world. Because their theory is Brahmam Satyam Jagat Mithya, which is a common phrase used by the impersonalists, and that translates to Brahman, the supreme spirit is truth, everything else is false. which means I don't exist, you don't exist, this building doesn't exist, this world doesn't exist, Krishna doesn't exist, Radharani doesn't exist. That's their philosophy, because they think that's all concocted, for less intelligent people. But the theory is flawed because it takes this into account that the supreme divine energy comes under the mode of material nature, which is not possible because the supreme divine energy always remains supreme, and there is parashakti and aparashakti. So it's a logical fallacy in the argument that Krishna comes in a material body, which is why Krishna himself mentions avajanti ma mudaha manushim tanumashadam param bhavam janto mama bhuta maheshwaram. He says, as fools deride me when I come in my human form, they do not know my transcendental nature, and I have dominion over all that may be. So Krishna already says that in Bhagavad Gita to refute this. And if you go to chapter 2, verse 14, Krishna mentions another important point about individuality, which is refuting the impersonalist theory. So if you go to chapter 2, verse 14, and just go to the translation, we see, chapter 2, verse 12. So chapter 2, verse 12, we see that never was there a time where I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be. So here Krishna says in text 12 of chapter 2 that there was never a time where Krishna didn't exist, nor you, Arjuna, nor all these kings, nor in the future any of us will cease to be. And this is what Sripad Ramanujacharya uses, that Sri Krishna says that I exist, you exist, all these kings always exist, which means Krishna is establishing individuality. Then when we move to chapter 3, verse 13, we see that everything we do, we offer to Krishna, it becomes karma free. So when we go to chapter 3, verse 13, which is Yagna Shishista Santo Munchante Sarvakile Vishahi, Munchante Te Twadam Papaya Pachadatmata Karana. So that is in the chapter called Karma Yoga, and in that the translation is that the devotees of the Lord are released from all kinds of sins because they eat food which is offered first for sacrifice. Others who prepared food for their own personal sense of enjoyment verily eat only sin. So here we see that the impersonalists, they may have some food that they eat, and they'll say that, okay, we need this food for sustenance, but then they'll count the number of chickpeas they're eating or count the number of grains of rice they're eating, because they think this is all material things. And I've met people before who said that, oh, well, I don't need to eat, and I can starve myself, and completely devoid myself of anything that's supposedly material. But the process of Yukta Vairagya is to use things that come from Krishna in the service of Krishna. Because ultimately, if we look into some of the earlier verses of chapter 3, Krishna says that I have created this universe, I've sent the grains, I've sent forth all the rains and all that's needed for sustenance, and a result of this, just use these particular items that come from me. Krishna says that I am the source of all that's material, all that is spiritual. So all that is material and all that's spiritual comes from Krishna. So when we use those particular items back as an offering to Krishna, that shows that we have true love and appreciation for Krishna and the supreme being, Krishna, the supreme personality of Godhead. But then when we realize that when we don't have that connection, it's almost like we are stealing. The demigods are giving us the rains, the sun, the moon, and we have the soil that is being tilled and gives us all these grains, fruits, flowers, and so forth, vegetables. And we realize that when we take and not offer back, it's almost like we're stealing. So therefore, the concept in chapter 3 is when we offer food offered for sacrifice unto Vishnu, that itself gets rid of all karma. And yajna, one of the primary deity where a yajna is being offered to is Vishnu. So therefore, if you see, for example, a fire sacrifice, and one wants to offer grains into the fire sacrifice, that fire sacrifice is considered to be non-different from Lord Vishnu's tongue, that we're offering that as a sacrifice. So again, there are two concepts of vairagya, renunciation, using that which we have in our possession in the service of Krishna, or completely rejecting everything in this material world that belongs, that we think as if it's material. So this type of renunciation is actually very artificial and false, because when one rejects everything in the material world, one's bound to fall back down into materialism because they're not attracted to anything. There's no positive engagement for a person to be attracted to. Whereas when we recognize that Krishna in his spiritual form, we take these material objects and we engage it in the service of Krishna, which originally comes from Krishna, then we are engaging it in the proper service. Otherwise, to think that everything in this world comes from Krishna and we're using it from our own enjoyment, that's considered, almost like, stealing, right? And we should always recognize that everything ultimately comes from Krishna. Even though we may think our own bodies, we may work hard, we may earn a paycheck, or we may gain some favor, we are putting effort, but ultimately the source of all of our energy comes from Krishna, because Krishna says, Mamai Vamsha Jiva Loke Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. Everyone is a part and parcel of me. Right? So Prabhupada's trying to emphasize in this point. And then we also see that what kind of foods that Krishna wants. Well, Patra Pushpam Phalam Toyam Yomi Bhaktya Prayashiti Tadaham Bhakti Uparitam Ashnami Prayadatmana. So in that verse, Bhakti is mentioned twice. Now, Bhakti is mentioned twice because Krishna is emphasizing that it's the devotion that he wants to have that re-established that's within us, between ourselves and Krishna, so that we are engaged in more permanent activities. For example, Krishna being the supreme person is permanent. We as individuals are permanent. We just read that in chapter 2, text 12. And then the service that's between us is also eternal and transcendental. So therefore, Krishna is trying to establish that within us. So we see that in the Bhagavad Gita, that there's not only eatables to be offered, but there's certain things to be offered, because Krishna essentially has given us this whole world as a package for offering. So if one can think that if one is about to go into one is about to go into a yajna to offer, one may bring fruits and vegetables and various different types of grains for offering, and one may be given this in a pallet. Okay, here you go, offer it, right? So similarly, we live in this world. In one sense, we are given this palette of, okay, there are these offerable objects, and it's up to us to utilize them in service of the Lord. So whatever we cook in our kitchens, for example, we offer it, it becomes karma-free, and that regulates us from recognizing that, okay, this is Krishna's blessed prasadam, so we honor and respect prasadam, and in doing so, we feel closer and closer in connection with Krishna. Whereas the materialist or the impersonalist as well, they see the food as, okay, I'm going to eat less and less, but it is material, and they ultimately get more and more bound by the snare of Maya. So that's one of the Maya's last tricks, is to think that, okay, Krishna actually doesn't have a form, Krishna doesn't exist, right? Which is kind of this theory of Advaitavada, which is, non-dualism. So if we go back to the verse, which is 263, we see in the purport that Prabhupada, what he's trying to say is, first he begins with the fact that there's this Palgu Vairagya, which is a lower important renunciation, but what we do as devotees is offer food and love and devotion, right? And the devotee does enjoy in this way because Krishna has enjoyed. And we partake in enjoyment that is in line with Krishna and Krishna's instructions for us. We do not think of enjoyment anything separate from Krishna, which is why many people, or all people, all individuals are in this material world, because we want to be independent of Krishna, and there's no such happiness that's in the truest, longest lasting sense that can be achieved when one is separate from Krishna. Only with the supreme permanent person, Krishna, can we actually have love and happiness, because Krishna is the source of all love and happiness. So we see here that towards the end of that purport, The devotee takes prasadam and Krishna consciousness, whereas the non-devotee rejects it as material. The impersonalist, however, therefore, cannot enjoy life due to his artificial renunciation. For this reason, a slight agitation of the mind pulls him down again into the pool of material existence. So that sentence is very important. So in the course of becoming spiritual, if you're just an impersonalist that rejects material things, then what happens is, all of a sudden, if there is an attractive material object or attractive material activity, we are bound to get attracted to that, and as a result, we basically fall down from the spiritual platform. Whereas a spiritualist, recognizing that Krishna is all attractive, activities in Krishna consciousness is fun and jovial, they contemplate on this, and they're always engaged in conversing about Krishna, chanting about Krishna, hearing about Krishna, and in this way they're always absorbed about Krishna that they never fall down. So through this positive engagement, we see that many practitioners of Bhakti Yoga are much higher than those who are artificially renouncers. An example would be, one example is Haridas Thakur, who is our Namacharya, who was constantly chanting the holy name, and he will send forth all sorts of distractions from his particular practice. But as a result of his strength on his attraction and absorption in the holy name, even so-called distractions that came to him, they themselves were attracted by his attraction for the holy name. And as a result, they become attracted to Krishna. Similarly, our proposition should be that by seeing Krishna's form, by hearing Krishna's message, by hearing Krishna's kirtan, we become more and more attracted to that. As a result of that attraction, we completely become absorbed in it. From some absorption, we go towards Krishna and we go away from Maya or materialism. And as a result, that's how a devotee thinks that, I become attracted to Krishna, I engage in the service of Krishna, I become absorbed in the service of Krishna, and in that absorption, I myself become aloof from any sort of petty material enjoyment or petty material activity or petty material gossip. I try and be aloof from that. And in that absorption, Srila Prabhupada said that one is completely absorbed in the state of Krishna consciousness. That is, the best type of samadhi. So that's what Prabhupada says. So we must take that state of trance, which is complete absorption, and we see that devotees from time immemorial have engaged in these types of activities. Whereas we may see on the opposite side yogis who may go into the forest and meditate and control their mind, control their senses, but because they haven't attracted themselves towards the Supreme Person Krishna, as soon as they may see some sort of material distraction, they completely fall away from the path. So in order to guard ourselves from not falling off, it's very important that we have positive engagement in life, whether we serve Krishna in the home, serve Krishna in the temple, serve Krishna in the public. There's various different ways where we can engage oneself, engage one's mind, engage one's intelligence. And Prabhupada himself says that when we read about Krishna in the form of Bhagavad Gita and the purports of the Acharyas, Srimad Bhagavatam, Chaitanya Charitamrita, there's an unlimited stock of Vedic literature. All we need to do is have a dedicated program on a daily basis to read, so that when we are doing our personal meditation of chanting the holy name, chanting the Mahamantra, we know how to act in a way in this world that will reflect that type of behavior of a Bhakti Yogi. Otherwise, what happens is, when there's kirtan and there's no katha or there's no philosophy, then it can just become, this type of fanaticism. Or if you have philosophy without the practice, then it becomes mental speculation. So both are required to nicely complement one another. So Prabhupada goes on to say that one falls down again due to not having his support in devotional service. So by practicing devotional service, there's another support we get. And that support is Krishna. Because Krishna says, Bhaktya mama vijananti. He does not say, And Prabhupada also mentions this in a lecture. Krishna doesn't say karma vijananti or jnana vijananti, which means that Krishna says that only through bhakti, devotion, you get to know me. Not through karma, not through jnana, not through action, not through simple knowledge. It's only through bhakti you get to know me. So therefore, Vaishnavas who practice bhakti yoga with all seriousness, strictness, and sincerity, they are able to understand and get closer to Krishna, because by them taking a step towards Krishna, Krishna takes 10 steps towards them. And those who worship, especially Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, because whatever is difficult, when one worships Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Nityananda Prabhu, they make things easy for you. And even Prabhupada says that Lord Chaitanya is even more compassionate than Krishna. Because Krishna came and he gave us the ultimate surrender verse, which is Sarva Dharma Parityaja. You just surrender unto me and I shall deliver you from all sinful reactions. But in the case of Jagai and Madai, who are two drunkards, women abusers, meat eaters, plunderers, they came and gave them the most type of compassion, most type of mercy, that they were able to grab onto that and become practitioners of bhakti. And that is a symptom of us being able to take the shelter of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, which is why before we chant the Mahamantra, we chant the Panchatattva Pranam Mantra. We offer our respects to these 5 personalities who appeared 500 years ago, who brought the Mahamantra and shared it with all the world. Whereas the Mahamantra before then, very secretive, in a certain community that we chanted, it's there in the Upanishads and so forth. To bring it out to the public without considering what's one's qualifications or external situations, and we can think about that for ourselves as well. We may think that living in a Western country, engaging in all sorts of activities that may not be related to spirituality, how are we qualified to receive all of this mercy? And all of this mercy is only possible because of the Panchatattva, bringing it and giving an example of giving it to everyone. And we are basically recipients of this great gift from the Panchatattva. And that gift from the Panchatattva, Srila Prabhupada has brought it to the Western countries, because before that, it was maybe around India for the most part. Some disciples of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta went to London and they were not as successful. But when Srila Prabhupada went to New York, he was able to convince really in every nook and corner of this world that one can really be Krishna conscious and share Krishna consciousness. And that's something that's a unique superpower that Srila Prabhupada had. So when one asks you, well, why is this world so horrible? It's full of death and suffering and sorrow. If there's a God, why did he create this? It's actually, we have to look at ourselves and see that why are we creating this situation for ourselves? It's only because of the humans quarreling with one another that we see that there's suffering, or human selfishness that we see that leads to suffering. Which is why if you go to text 62 of chapter 2, we see that the verse begins with Dhyayato Vishayam Pumsaha Sangas Seju Pajayate Sangat Sanjayate Kamaha Kamata Krodho Vijayate. So when we think about any sort of war, any sort of quarrel, it begins with when contemplating the objects of the senses, a person develops an attachment for them. Which means that if I live in a certain land and I think my land is mine and I'm supposed to have some more land, that is also because of Dhyayato Vishayam Pumsaha. Or the fact that I have certain resources such as water or food, but I'm going to keep it for my people and let people on the other side of the hills suffer and starve. Again, that's a result of Dhyayato Vishayam Pumsaha. And this is why there may be, you may heard of, scarcity and shortages of resources. And people say, well, it's because of overpopulation. But, Prabhupada's take on that is actually, it's because of human greed that we are in this situation. And people are envious of one another. When we think about friendship, right? Friendship is very important to have in society, and even within devotee communities, it's important to have friendship. That friendship is based on cooperating with one another to serve the Supreme Father. Prabhupada says in the introduction that the individual soul, which is us, the individual soul, not the body, we are meant to be cooperators. Cooperate with one another, having the Supreme Father as the overarching supreme authority, and following the instruction of the spiritual teachers. And in this way, we can live in harmony in this world. But if we think that we'll just be friends because you can give me some sense gratification, I can give you some sense gratification, and in this way we'll live, and then we'll be envious of one another and see how we can bring each other down, that leads to human downfall. So again, if anybody asks, why is there human downfall, you can point to these verses, chapter 2, verse 62 and 63, which is Dhyayato Vishayam Pumsaha Sangas Tejo Vijayate Sangat Sanjayate Kamaha Kamata Krodho Vijayate Krodhat Bhavati Samoha Samo Bhavati Vibramaha Buddhi Nasha Pranashiti. So that is Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, beautifully summarizing why are there pitfalls in this world. And again, if we want to guard ourselves against those pitfalls, by surrendering unto Krishna and taking through this process of Bhakti Yoga, we slowly begin our process of getting rid of our negative karmic reactions. And in doing so, we cooperate with one another in serving the Lord. And in doing so, we live a life so simple and so sublime that we actually get to experience true enjoyment when we are in the service of the Lord. And there's so many activities that are within Krishna consciousness that are all spiritual activities, and in doing so, we ultimately are the true renounced people from this material world. Hare Krishna. So, time for any questions or reflections from those two verses, or maybe this is the second verse. Again, these verses are important to contemplate on, and it's important to even read these verses from time to time, because they make us more and more absorbed. Another example I can also give is if we move to chapter 18, verse 10. So this is towards the end of the Gita. Prabhupada is so compassionate that you'll see this in his purport. So if you go to chapter 18, verse 10, Prabhupada says, one who is not in Krishna consciousness should not give up earning money out of fear that he is performing fruitive activities. If by working one can engage his money in Krishna consciousness, or if by rising early in the morning one can advance his transcendental Krishna consciousness, one should not desist out of fear, because such activities are considered troublesome. Such renunciation is in the mode of passion. The result of passionate work is always miserable. If a person renounces work in that spirit, he never gets a result of renunciation. And then in the following purport, this is text 8 and 9, Prabhupada says that prescribed duties must be performed with this mentality. One should act without attachment for the result. He should be disassociated from the modes of work. A man working in Krishna consciousness in a factory does not associate himself with the work of the factory, nor with the workers of the factory. He simply works for Krishna. And when he gives up the result for Krishna, he's acting transcendentally. So again, that's text 8 and 9 of chapter 18, purport, where Prabhupada is saying that one need not think that when one works in a particular vocation or factory that they are a fruitive person. If one works in the spirit that Krishna is the overarching principle, that who is our ultimate master, whom we surrender all of our heart and love to, and we give our fruits of labor unto Krishna and serving Krishna, in that way one can be truly renounced. Because oftentimes there's a question that, well, you're either a spiritualist on one end or completely materialist on the other end. There's no in between, where one's completely in a forest or completely engrossed in material activities. But one can be engaged in this world using that as a service to Krishna. And that's what Prabhupada mentions here in this text 8 and text 9 of chapter 18. So, questions or reflections?
I have a question.
Yes.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you for the lecture. It was very nice. So how do you draw a line between, so you use everything in the service of Krishna.
Mhm.
However, there must be some renunciation, right? Because once you get too attached to material things, it kind of holds you back from your spiritual life, right? But life is made up in such a way where you have to kind of overachieve in order to get anything materially in this life.
Mhm.
How do you draw the line? How do you find that balance and to not overachieve it, but at the same time using everything in the service of Krishna?
Okay, good question. So the question for those of you in the back is, how do you use everything in the service of Krishna? Because in the material world, it seems like we have to, engage in some endeavor and have some goals to achieve. How do we really have a boundary to achieve that? So Prabhupada mentions this in Canto 1 of the Bhagavatam, that we use material things for self-preservation, not self-glorification. So that's one difference. Is we have material things, so we use it for self-preservation. So self-preservation meaning, okay, I need to have some sustenance for food, some shelter, water, clothing, so forth. But then self-glorification would be, well, I'm going to over-endeavor to get this particular material habit or material object that's going to serve way beyond that what I need. So that is where you create your boundary. And if you think about even with work, there are certain jobs that we must perform, and there are certain jobs that are not very conducive for us as devotees. For example, if one were to perform a vocation which is, say, in relation to looking after the environment or building up some software, those are things which are seen to be, it's not going to bound you as much in karma as opposed to, say, if you work in a place that's like a pesticide facility or a chemical factory that will, food place, especially in North America where there's meat and all that involved, that's going to bind you to karma even more, much worse. So regardless of what work we have, it's still going to bind us to karma. So what we do is we use the fruits of that work to be engaged in the service of the Lord so that our activities become karma free, right? So that's one way of looking at it, avoiding the gross sinful jobs, right? So that's really important that we have that boundary. And when we have that boundary, that is showing that we're putting a foot down and saying that, Krishna, this is what I'm going to do for you. And the result of you stepping for Krishna, Krishna will provide a way in which you're able to maintain yourself. Because when we have firm faith that Krishna is providing for the birds and the beasts outside, similarly we should also have firm faith that Krishna, by rendering menial service to him, he's always going to be there for us. And that is one of the 6 processes of surrender, which is Anukulyena Sankalpa, Pratukulyecha Varchana, Rakshishititi Vishwaso. So, accept that which is favorable for devotional service, reject that which is unfavorable for devotion. So you can look at your life and look at this rubric. What activities are favorable for me in my devotional consciousness, which is not favorable. So if I were to go to my job, do my work and come back, and I find that that's more than enough that I have to deal with materialism, that's fine. But if I were to go to my job and get involved in all these petty politics within my work and fight with one another to get a position, it takes so much of my energy that it's not worth it. So that's where we create a boundary. So we must look at our life and see where we can create boundaries. Because if there's unhealthy boundaries or unhealthy activities, we must create boundaries to protect ourselves. And that is known as protecting the bhakti creeper. So we must think of our bhakti consciousness or a bhakti capacity is like a creeper plant. But that creeper plant has to have a fence around it, right? So that fence is basically your boundaries that protect you in your bhakti life and your bhakti practice. Otherwise, you find that anything can come in and just basically destroy or trample your bhakti creeper. So we must really be careful in protecting our bhakti creeper. And the way we do it is with enthusiasm, patience, having firm faith in the rules and regulated principles, having the association of devotees, and being very straightforward in dealing with people. This is how we can really be successful in our bhakti Krishna consciousness. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, question.
When we talk about anger,
Mhm.
but sometimes anger is very instantaneous.
Mm.
Before you could even process certain things, right away you start speaking, or you get. How do we kind of cope with that?
Okay, so the question is, sometimes when we think about anger is very instantaneous, and how do we really cope with the fact that we can become angry all of a sudden? So one thing one can do is every morning, in the 12th canto of the Bhagavatam, it's mentioned that in Kali Yuga, a person will be considered fit to appear in public just because they've taken a bath. What that's meant by that is, people will not be inclined towards performing their spiritual practices in the morning, which is why it's important for every one of us here, in here and out there, to have a dedicated spiritual practice in the morning. The reason why that is because by chanting with all sincerity the Hare Krishna Mahamantra on your beads, you will gain this sense of peacefulness and tranquility that will carry forward throughout the day. And as a result of which, it can help you mitigate some of those moments that come out of anger. And why do you feel angry all of a sudden? It's because the material mode of passion, rajas, has taken over your overall consciousness state of being. Which means that you have to constantly endeavor in your life towards making your life, your thoughts, your actions, your words, your deeds in the mode of goodness, and try to increase that pie. Because when you think about, a 3-chart pie, you have goodness, sattva, rajas, passion, tamas, ignorance. And there are these 3 divisions. What we try to do is we want to increase the mode of goodness more and reduce the material mode of passion and darkness. So we have to endeavor with activities, responsibilities that are in the mode of goodness. And then also, when we are getting those sorts of angry moments that trigger us, we must realize that either try and avoid those situations, avoid those types of experiences or even people who trigger us that way, and just to really think of how can we really stop in case we come in contact with those types of stimuli, that expanding the time between what I say and do versus react right away. Because to react right away is very instinctive. And in one sense that can be considered, very, very like animalistic, right? But we are human beings. We have the ability to contemplate. And we must use that contemplation with our buddhi, with our intelligence, to discern between what is spiritual and what is material, what is beneficial for my Krishna consciousness, what is detrimental. So that analytical mind and analytical nature and structure needs to really be built into our life. That we always think about what is beneficial for me spiritual, what is detrimental. And when we expand upon that time, when we do our japa in the morning, when we do some reading on a daily basis, it's important to read spiritual literatures on a daily basis because it transfers our thoughts to spiritual subject matters. And in doing so, it gives us a way in which we know how to act and be in this world. And that's really important to do because otherwise we'll find ourselves lost. Right? And Krishna. If you have your Bhagavad Gita, you can place it on the shelf there, and we can all rise for the noon arti.